For 2 years, I lived in Scotland in an intentional community of spiritual seekers. And at one particularly low point for me, I was determined to poison them all. Now, I stumbled across this place on the internet. It was called Braemar, and I was in search of a place where I could go to escape from what I thought was a boring life at the time. I just needed to do something different. Now, Braemar was like a miniature version of Downton Abbey, except that there we were all servants. They had 200 acres of pastures and forests and hillsides. There was a 22-room Georgian mansion. There were cottages, and there was a long stone barn that had been converted into a dormitory. Now, they were looking for volunteer staff to come help and run the place, and they said I could come help out on the grounds. I could help take care of the grounds and the gardens and look after the poultry. So that's what I did. Now, people from all over the world came to this place to take courses in spiritual enrichment. And they had a philosophy there. The main philosophy was what they called the unity of existence. And what this means in plain English is we are all one. No matter your religion, your skin color, no matter your gender or non-gender, no matter whom you choose to love or not love, whether you have big hands or tiny hands, we are all one. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, even atheists came to Braemar. Actually, I don't believe in atheists. But people came to Braemar to contemplate God and to learn how to love their fellow human being. So how did we practice loving our fellow human being? It didn't involve quaaludes, I can tell you that. We practiced loving one another by being in service. So it didn't matter what your role was there, whether you were a student or on staff. Everybody was expected to pitch in when and where needed. So on any given day, you might bake bread, or you might weed the garden, or you might rake leaves, you might clean toilets, you might muck out the chicken coops. But the purpose of doing these tasks wasn't just to get the job done. The purpose was to clear your mind of junk and to just focus on being of service. So you might feel the rag as you dusted the top of the dresser, or you might feel the soil as you helped plant carrots. Another way to help the students get focused is that they were forbidden from doing certain things. So they couldn't drink alcohol, they couldn't watch television, they couldn't read the newspaper, they couldn't engage in amorous endeavors. Of course, we staff and students could poison our minds and bodies as long as as much as we wanted, and we could fornicate to our heart's content, as long as it did not affect the well-being of the students or the work that we were there to do. So that was all great. Now, there were certain foods that were prohibited there as well, and that included shellfish and pork and garlic. Now, garlic was forbidden, and I didn't know this before, but apparently the smell of it drives the angels away. So in all fairness, the students practiced this form of moving meditation every evening after supper, and they got all sweaty doing this. So I could understand that if garlic had been on our menu, any angels with a Braemar landing permit might be persuaded to change their flight plans. Just before Christmas one year, all of the students and most of the staff went on a pilgrimage to Turkey. This was part of their studies there. That left about a dozen of us behind to look after the place. So we went from about 40 people down to about a dozen. Now, normally this wouldn't have been a problem, except that the Turkey pilgrims weren't going to return until around December 20th, and we were expecting more than 100 guests for Christmas that year. So we had just had a water shortage. This was Scotland, don't ask me how this happened. But we had had a water shortage, which means we couldn't do laundry for 2 weeks. And we had to prepare just the 12 of us, we had to prepare all these guest rooms, and we had to do food preparation, and we had to clean the entire place in preparation for these guests, in addition to all of our regular chores. But I was ready. I showed up with a broomstick in one hand and an iron in the other, and a kitchen knife in the other hand, and a toilet bowl brush in the other hand. The only problem was not everybody was as eager as me to do the work. So after about a week of busting my back, washing and ironing and folding linen tablecloths and bed sheets and towels, I started to get a little resentful of the people who weren't doing their fair share. I could feel a sinus infection brewing as well, and back home I used to eat garlic, raw garlic, to help ward off infections, but I couldn't do that at Braemar because of the angel thing. So the Braemar natural cure for warding off infections was to take pieces of onion and soak them in honey and then let that settle for a while and then drink the juices later. So one morning, it wasn't as bad as all that. So one morning, and I know because I drank it. One morning I diced an onion and I put it in a bowl and I covered it in honey and I put plastic wrap over this bowl, and to that plastic wrap I taped a note, and on that note I had written in big black Sharpie, "Sarah's do not eat." And I set the bowl aside in the kitchen, and then at lunch that day, after lunch, several people stood up from the table and they just started walking away without even clearing their plates. This really set me off. I shot up out of my chair and I shouted, "That's it! I am not washing one more dish for you bloody people." And I stormed out of the dining room and I went to the kitchen. I just needed to drink that oniony juice and go to bed. But when I got to the kitchen, my healing concoction was gone. Just then the cook walked in. "What happened to my onions?" "I used them in the lunch." "What, you can't read? It had a note, Sarah's do not eat." The cook took a few steps back. I didn't see it. After staring at him for a sufficient amount of time, I stormed down to my room and I crawled in bed. Well, a few minutes later, this woman called Lydia knocked on my door and she came in, and she was clearly distressed to see me this way. "Sarah, it's not like you to yell at a table full of people. We're really not supposed to do that here." "Well, I am fed up with everybody and everything. How come these freeloaders get to eat at the trough while just a few of us run around doing all this work?" Well, Lydia reminded me of a story about the sisters Mary and Martha from the Gospel of Luke. And for those of you who don't know that story, in a nutshell, Mary and Martha had invited Jesus over for supper one night because, after all, Jesus had just raised their brother Lazarus from the dead. So Martha was running around getting all prepared. She was cleaning, she was cooking, she was doing all the work, while Mary got to sit at the feet of Jesus and enjoy his exalted company. Well, this pissed Martha off. So Martha said to Jesus, "You tell Mary to get off her fat, lazy behind and help out." And Jesus told Martha, "Chill, sister." The moral of the story, Lydia said, is that there are more important things to do than running around all busy like. She said to me, "Don't get distracted by the work, because there's an underlying reason for this work that you're doing. What good are you to this community if your service is tainted with resentment?" Now, get some rest, Sarah. The work will get done. Don't worry about it. People will step up when they're ready to step up. The important thing is that you understand your limits and stop when you need to, because you're only human. Now, of course, Lydia was right, but I wasn't going to be satisfied until I got revenge. After all, I'm just human. So later that afternoon, I drove into town and I bought a bulb of garlic. In our sacred kitchen, I chopped every clove of that forbidden fruit into fragrant chunks. And I used the cook's favorite knife to do it, and I didn't wash it afterwards. I used a yellow cutting board, which was only supposed to be used to chop fruit. And I didn't wash that off afterwards either. I put the garlic in a bowl, I covered it in honey, and I set the bowl over on a table next to some cooling loaves of bread. And I even tried wafting that garlic over onto the bread. What I didn't do was put a note on it saying, "Do not eat." I had hoped that the cook would not notice it was garlic and he would use it in the supper that night. I was going to sit there at that table and I was going to watch every single person eat forkful after forkful of poison stir fry. And I was going to relish every stinking second of it. Angels would stop coming, people would fall ill, I didn't care, they deserved it, these slackers. Only none of that happened. The garlic was still there after supper that night, and after lunch the next day, and again after supper the next day. So in defeat, I ended up drinking the juices myself. But I didn't wash out the bowl. Later, I did feel better both physically and emotionally, if not a little humbled. The moral of the story is, serving others, loving others is about action as well as contemplation. It's about knowing when to work and also knowing when to rest. I don't know whether angels hate the smell of garlic, and I don't even know whether garlic does cure infections, but this I do know. Even in service to God, sometimes a little rebellion can cure what ails you.